Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Donald Trump is not usually short of an opinion or two, but he's arrived in London promising not to get involved in our election. The president is here for a NATO meeting, but it wasn't long before he was asked whether the NHS would be on the table in any future trade talks with Britain. He insisted he didn't want anything to do with it, but that hasn't stopped the argument between the major parties. In a moment, our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins, will have more on the NATO meeting. But first, our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, looks at how Mr. Trump's comments have played out politically.
Donald Trump's in town, and there's a general election next week. Two things likely to make Boris Johnson's team pretty nervous.
I've won a lot of elections for a lot of people.
The convention is that world leaders don't get involved in other countries' domestic affairs.
I'll stay out of the election.
But the president was soon in full flow, happy to take questions on whether America wanted access to the NHS as part of a trade deal.
We wouldn't want to. If you handed it to us on a silver platter, we want nothing to do with it.
Last week, Jeremy Corbyn produced papers showing talks about a UK-US trade deal took place when Theresa May was in charge. But there's no proof of negotiations about privatising the health service.
Obviously, we want a good relationship with the USA, but the trade talks that have been undertaken by the government have been done in secret, and we do not accept any idea of US companies coming in to run our National Health Service, or the idea of extending the patents on medicine, which will increase the costs for our National Health Service.
Mr. Johnson's repeatedly ruled out including any part of the NHS in trade talks. His focus today was on security, visiting Salisbury, where a former Russian spy was poisoned last year. Mr. Johnson's accused the Labour leader of siding with Britain's enemies.
There is a stark contrast between our approach, which sees the value of NATO as the protector and guarantor of our security, and that of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, who actually want to disband NATO. It seems to be a quite incredible position to take.
While Mr. Corbyn says there are no plans to scrap NATO, despite previously questioning its role. As for Donald Trump staying out of this election campaign,
I think Boris is very capable, and I think he'll do a good job.
Would you be able to work with a possible Prime Minister Corbyn, or is that...
I can work with anybody. I'm a very easy person to work with.
For decades, British Prime Ministers have boasted about the special relationship with America. But this close to election day, Boris Johnson's team would prefer to be controlling events, and they can't guarantee that Donald Trump will go along with that. And of course, Donald Trump is not the kind of man who can be easily controlled. He is coming here for a reception tonight, but alongside all the other NATO leaders. It does seem to be a matter of safety in numbers for Boris Johnson. There is no one-to-one meeting planned, at least not in front of the cameras. There will be no joint press conference, and that's because the Conservative campaign team know that actually an endorsement from Mr. Trump is not necessarily a vote winner with everybody. But very hard to keep the president quiet. He'll be back in front of the microphones tomorrow. And of course, there's always his Twitter feed.
Vicky, thank you very much. Well, from Downing Street, the NATO leaders are already heading off an evening at Buckingham Palace, and our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins is there. James.
Generally speaking, British governments have been proud of the country's leading role in NATO throughout the years since its foundation in 1949. It looks as if actually Donald Trump is just coming in now. So Buckingham Palace seems a fitting place for a birthday party to celebrate the alliance's 70th birthday. But are the leaders really in party mood when there are so many cracks in this alliance of 29 nations pledged to each other's defence? A warning, my report does contain flash photography. Good afternoon. NATO leaders are in London to celebrate 70 years of their alliance and joint success keeping the peace. But today this looked more like a family at war with itself. France's President Macron has been strongly critical of Donald Trump's role and even called NATO strategically brain dead. Today he stood by those remarks even after Mr. Trump rebuked him publicly.
When you make a statement like that, that is a very, very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries. I think that, you have a very high unemployment rate in France. France is not doing well economically at all.
In fact, the alliance faces another far larger threat to unity, the military action by NATO member Turkey inside northern Syria. Turkey's President Erdogan is enraged NATO isn't 100% supportive of his fight against Kurdish troops he brands terrorists. But President Macron completely rejects the Turkish position.
When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us, shoulder to shoulder, against ISIS.
70 years ago, when NATO was established, it all felt so much simpler. The American-led alliance faced a single enemy, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. It was Soviet communism which eventually collapsed. NATO survived, but now struggles to agree its future role.
NATO is the most successful alliance in history because we have been able to change when the world is changing. That's exactly what we are doing again, and the fact is that we are doing more together in this alliance now than we have done for many decades.
All this is the backdrop to tonight's reception at Buckingham Palace. The 29 NATO leaders are gathering here, including President Trump. They're struggling for a way through profound present divisions, as well as trying to find consensus on how to face future threats. And there's Donald Trump just walking up the steps inside Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen at the beginning of this birthday anniversary reception. And those future threats to NATO I was talking about, well, still from Russia, of course. There'll be talk of China as well, and of cyber threats from whatever source, including possibly to satellites in space. We can imagine, I think, can't we, the Queen in Buckingham Palace tonight using all her diplomatic skills to try to edge the leaders closer together. George.
James, thank you very much. For the first time during this election campaign, Jeremy Corbyn has apologised for incidents of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He was criticised for refusing to do so 4 times in a recent interview with the BBC's Andrew Neil. Speaking on daytime TV, Mr Corbyn said he was very sorry and insisted he was dealing with the issue.
Our party,
I want you to say sorry.
And our party and me, do not accept anti-Semitism in any form.
So are you sorry for anything that's happened?
Obviously, I'm very sorry for everything that's happened. But I want to make this clear. I am dealing with it. I have dealt with it.
The broadcasting regulator Ofcom has decided not to investigate a Conservative Party complaint against last week's Channel 4 debate on the climate crisis. The party had complained about the broadcaster's intention to empty chair the Conservatives with an ice sculpture. The media regulator said the use of the ice did not break rules on due impartiality and broadcasting during elections.
Heads of state are meeting in London tonight to mark the 70th anniversary of the military alliance NATO. The Queen is hosting celebrations here at Buckingham Palace, but conversation over the canapes may be somewhat awkward. Donald Trump has so far managed to have a spat with the French president, to slip in that Boris Johnson would do a good job if he wins the election, and to deny that the US has any interest in the NHS, even if it was on a silver platter in post-Brexit trade talks. In the last hour, delegates had been greeted by the Prime Minister, Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall inside Buckingham Palace just behind me. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has more.
The moment Boris Johnson's team dreaded. The man, the motorcade, the mouth. What might he say, and could he play into Labour's election campaign?
Today, Donald Trump has arrived in Britain. I saw it because his convoy went past my house last night. So I know he's here. Our NHS will not be put up for sale to anybody.
Jeremy Corbyn said he'd deliver that message in person to the President this evening at a Buckingham Palace reception. The President spent the day in meetings in London, but Boris Johnson was campaigning in Salisbury. He'd turned down the opportunity for a one-on-one chat with Donald Trump, worried it could harm him with voters here.
Prime Minister, you're not meeting Donald Trump for a private talk this week, and you're the host of NATO, so what's that about?
Well, actually, I'm meeting not only the President of the United States, I'm meeting every one of the NATO leaders, as you'd expect.
You're meeting Angela Merkel, President Macron and President Erdogan today for a private meeting, and you're not doing the same with Donald Trump. Well, is he an embarrassment?
No, on the contrary, and we have good relations with, I have good relations with Washington.
At one of those bilaterals Boris Johnson dodged, Donald Trump met the NATO Secretary-General. and promised to keep out of the UK election.
I'll stay out of the election. You know that I was a fan of Brexit, but I stay out of it. I think Boris is very capable, and I think he'll do a good job.
An endorsement he didn't really want, but was safely out of the room and couldn't hear.
Should the National Health Service be on the table in trade talks?
No, not at all. I have nothing to do with it. Never even thought about it. We have absolutely nothing to do with it, and we wouldn't want to. If you handed it to us on a silver platter, we want nothing to do with it.
He said he had no idea where it all came from, but this was President Trump speaking here in June.
Look, I think everything with the trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that. But everything will be on the table, absolutely.
Donald Trump himself said everything is on the table, including our National Health Service.
Jeremy Corbyn was on daytime TV making the most of what his team sees as a propaganda gift.
He's in the Alpine Lodge.
Very comfortable in our Alpine Lodge by the fire there.
Back at the US ambassador's residence, the president seemed to be suffering another memory loss.
Mr. President, do you have a comment on Prince Andrew stepping down from his royal duties?
No, I don't know Prince Andrew, but it's a tough story. It's a very tough story. I don't know him. No.
In fact, he's seen him quite a few times over the years. Most recently, this summer. He's even boasted about playing a round of golf with Prince Andrew. Turkey's President Erdogan was amongst the NATO leaders holding talks at number 10. Turkey's closeness to Russia, one of many tensions at this NATO summit. President Trump taunted President Macron. Would he take back ISIS fighters originally from France, who US troops were now guarding in Syria?
They're mostly from Europe, and some of the countries are agreeing. I have not spoken to the president about that. Would you like some nice ISIS fighters?
Look, if you look at the situation,
you can take everyone you want.
Let's be serious. The very large number of fighters you have on the ground are ISIS fighters coming from Syria, from Iraq, and the region. Your number one problem are not the foreign fighters. This is the ISIS fighters in the region. And you have more and more of these fighters due to the situation today.
This is why he's a great politician, because that was one of the greatest non-answers I've ever heard. And that's okay.
As they readied Buckingham Palace for the NATO reception, President Trump was taking on another NATO ally. Was Canada coughing up the 2% of GDP on defence spending that NATO sets as a guideline?
We'll put Canada on a payment plan, right? I'm sure the Prime Minister would love that. What are you at? What is your number?
The number we talk about is 70% increase over these past years.
Okay. Where are you now in terms of your number?
We're at 135?
1.3.
1.4. And continuing to move forward.
They're getting there.
The US President's convoy making its way to Buckingham Palace this evening. All leaders were greeted by palace staff at the door. But this US Secret Serviceman suggested he should take over for the President's armour-plated limo. It's NATO's 70th anniversary gathering, but there's no air of celebration. President Macron described NATO last month as brain dead. President Trump today dismissed that as insulting, but he himself has called NATO obsolete.
Gary Gibbon reporting there. Well, in about 20 minutes from now, you can expect a traffic jam of motorcades somewhere at the end of Downing Street as almost 30 NATO leaders converge on Downing Street for dinner with Boris Johnson. All very festive, frankly. We're also going to have a choir here, by the way. Now, before we came on air, I spoke to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry, and I began by asking her whether Labour are rather disappointed that Donald Trump hasn't backed up Jeremy Corbyn's claim that the NHS is for sale.
Yes, well, he has a somewhat loose relationship with the truth, doesn't he? And he may be
lying about that.
I'm just saying that he may have been told some lines to speak, and it may even be that he's agreed them with Boris Johnson as well. But frankly, nobody believes either of them. Listen, he says, I don't even know. He says, I don't even know how it came up. The reason it came up was because last time he was here, he said that the NHS was on the table. And now he says he doesn't want it on a silver platter.
But you were hoping that Donald Trump, by putting his foot in it somewhere, would save your election campaign, a week and a half before the election. He's not doing that for you, is he?
I don't agree with the premise of the question. We don't need Donald Trump to save us. Thank you very much. You know, what we need is to be able to convince people on the doors that they should give us the opportunity to serve and transform our country. Donald Trump has how much longer in this country? I mean, he's got long enough, frankly, and he's got his Twitter.
You're hoping that he'll say something.
I have no idea how long he's going to be able to maintain any discipline. But the bottom and top of it is this. Is that, of course, pharmaceutical companies are interested in the data in relation to 60 million patients that we have on the National Health Service. Of course, they're interested in that. Of course, they're interested in how much pharmaceuticals can be sold to the NHS. Of course, they're interested in that. We've seen it in the paperwork.
And now we know it's off the table.
And now we know that Donald Trump has been told that he has to say it's off the table.
There's some question about that documentary evidence, isn't there?
Well, what questions are there?
The questions are that it might have been, you know, there's on the Reddit website, which is where this document has come from, there are questions around the veracity of that information. Has it been planted by someone?
If the government, I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? You know, they've had a good few days now since we have produced these documents, which seem to have been circulating around the internet. And then finally, 3 or 4 days later, you know, at last, the government possibly may be saying that they're not true. Let's see. Let them come out and say that what's in those documents is not true and that they didn't have those discussions.
Let's talk about NATO. That's why we're here to some extent. That's why Donald Trump is here. Now, Jeremy Corbyn on the Jeremy Vine show today said it was tit for tat for the Warsaw Pact and it deepened the Cold War. I mean, whatever you say about Donald Trump, he's more in favour of NATO than your party leader is.
But Jeremy was talking about NATO in the past. What we need to talk about is NATO's future. And what we said in the 2017 manifesto and in the 2019 manifesto is that we are committed to NATO. Now, listen, there needs to be changes. There are all kinds of things that NATO could be doing. They could strengthen itself by modernising. For example, you know, one of the biggest threats...
about NATO in the past, I mean, this is important, isn't it? This is about history. Deepening of the Cold War. It is the existence of NATO that, to a large extent, allowed the Cold War to be won by the West without a single shot being fired.
What's important is ensuring that we keep our country safe now. What's important is what Labour would do to make sure that we keep our country safe.
Jeremy Corbyn got his history correct or not on this one?
Jeremy Corbyn is correct to support NATO. That is what's in our manifesto, and it was in our last manifesto.
And you, at the moment, according to the polls, you're not going to be winning it. Now, why is that?
But the moment the country is holding its breath and we're waiting for the people to decide, they're the ones who are going to decide. It doesn't matter about opinion polls. If you remember, just from 2 years ago, how far behind we were supposed to be in the opinion polls, and then look what happened.
You did better than expected, but you still lost the election. You still lost the election.
And the hunger that I see amongst our activists who rightly believe that we did as well as we did. We got a more of an increase in the Labour vote than we had done since 1945. Yes, we didn't win, and we need another push. And in the next week or so, we shall see what happens, because we are still out on doorsteps. We are still out there winning hearts and minds, and we are telling people there's another way than this. We do not need to have this shambles. You put your trust in Labour.
Emily Thornberry, thanks very much.
Well, I'm joined here at Buckingham Palace by the Conservative chairman in the last Parliament of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Tugendhat. You can hear from the protesters, you know, how people view Donald Trump's, or some people view Donald Trump's arrival here in London. So that endorsement of Boris Johnson as a, you know, excellent leader would do a very good job after the election. That's in a way the last thing your party needs, isn't it?
Well, even a stop clock tells the right time twice a day. So, you know, it's not surprising that people get that right. Because he will do a good job, so that's hardly a surprising thing to say.
Did you need an endorsement from someone who is seen by some within your own party as pretty toxic?
Look, Nick Griffin endorsed Jeremy Corbyn. I think we've all got people who we don't want to endorse us. That's
not,
just
I'm not
part
sure
of
in
life,
quite the same way.
But
I mean, he said he'd stay out of the election. He played along with Downing Street's script, but his intervention on the NHS, was that helpful, do you think?
Well, I think what's helpful is that he and now everybody else has made it clear that there is absolutely no question of the NHS being for sale. Everybody knows that the NHS has been under Conservative management, as it were, for more than half its life, and that's where the investment, the real investment, is coming from. I mean, your own focus group yesterday showed that people don't trust pie-in-the-sky promises. They do trust real figures and real pledges.
But he might have made that clear today, but just 6 months ago he said everything is on the table, so NHS or anything else. Do you believe that Donald Trump or the Donald Trump today?
Well,
neither?
The people I believe are the British people who are never going to allow their NHS to be sold. So I don't think it matters terribly what an American president says. I trust the British people to select representatives who will carry out their instructions. Their instructions are completely clear.
Very interesting you say you trust the British people. Do you trust the Prime Minister who's insisted that the NHS
because he will be elected by the British people. He will be a representative of the British people.
Let's look at the global picture, because that's what originally this meeting was about. Given this Macron-Trump spat, does that, do you think, show where the real power in this alliance lies?
I think what it shows is that there is a real challenge for the international community in setting the future world order. And I think this is a real opportunity for the United Kingdom. Look, when Boris Johnson achieves a majority in Parliament and has actually left the European Union, there's a huge opportunity for him to do what the world is crying out for, which is to look again at the international order and to actually go around talking to world leaders. France, the United States are two very obvious examples, but there are many others around the world, and talk about resetting a global agenda that has really, frankly, lost its way. If you look at the struggles that the UN is having, or NATO, or indeed the European Union, all of these organizations are struggling because actually the change in China, the change in India, whether you see it as positive or negative, is really resetting the world to a new world order.
But what's Britain's role in that? Because, I mean, you looked at the sort of power dynamic of Macron and Trump, you know, this spat has sort of transfixed people here today. Where is Britain in all of that? Where is Boris Johnson?
Well, there's a traditional attitude that people talk, as you rightly just did, about power, and that is the old way of looking at it. And I would look at it differently. I would say, look, we used to have an empire of power. That's what shaped the UK for 200 years. We're now looking at an empire of the mind. That mind, what I mean by that is the intellectual underpinning of the global economy, the rule of law, accountancy. Some of the significantly less sexy things in life are actually underpinned by British standards and British ideas and concepts, whether it's contract law or indeed accountancy.
But given what NATO was set up to do, is it now fit for purpose in this new world?
Well, I think it certainly is. I mean, the old line, of course, is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And certainly that's exactly what it's achieved extremely successfully for the best part of 70 years. And actually, look, there are challenges. Let's not kid ourselves. There are challenges about the funding of NATO. But the reality is that NATO is facing a Russian threat very effectively, not just in a military sense, but if you look at the cyber centre in Estonia, if you look at the way that NATO has reacted to, for example, the Skripal attack, you see an alliance that is not only ready but actually fit for the 21st century, but certainly needs some updating too.
Tom Dinkelhat, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, there is growing evidence of division among leaders on the future of NATO as a war of words continued throughout the day between Presidents Trump and Macron. Tomorrow's leaders' meeting, involving 29 member states, including Russia, could see heated talks on a number of issues, including Turkey's military actions in Syria and President Macron's recent comments about NATO becoming brain dead. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman joins me now. Jonathan, what is the mood of this meeting so far?
I think as far as British officials are concerned, they are walking on eggshells and hoping it can all be pulled off without too much incident. Look, the leaders' meeting is only 3 hours long tomorrow morning. Each leader will get about 3 or 4 minutes to speak, and then there will be press conferences afterwards. So it's going to be pretty quick. And NATO on one level, as Tom Dinkelhat was saying, is in good shape. There are 29 members, a 30th, North Macedonia is going to join next year. Cyber and outer space are going to be declared as NATO operational domains. But one Ministry of Defence official has talked about what he calls the president's problem. The 3 presidents, Presidents Trump, President Macron and President Erdogan. President Trump is obsessed with other countries paying their way, what he calls freeloaders. He called countries delinquents that weren't paying their fair contributions. to NATO today. President Macron is less concerned about Russia, more concerned about the Sahel, about ISIS and Al-Qaeda regrouping in Africa, and he is furious with President Erdogan, and we've got some pictures of President Erdogan at Buckingham Palace this evening, and President Erdogan has looked pretty grim all day, as if he really doesn't want to be here at all and would rather be in Ankara. He is basically saying to NATO, if you don't recognize Kurdish YPG groups as terrorists, then we will block the publication of a defense plan for the Baltics tomorrow. Earlier today I spoke to Artis Pabriks, the Defence Minister of Latvia, and I asked him what he made of a spat today between President Trump and President Macron. President Trump saying that it was very, very nasty of President Macron to declare that NATO is brain dead.
I don't want to comment on the exact wording of American president, but also in our region around the Baltic Sea and in the north of Europe, let's say we were a little bit surprised by such exclamations of French president, because we don't consider that we are brain dead, we can think. That's first. Secondly, I don't think that NATO as an alliance is weak at this moment, or weaker than before. It's not.
Are you saying that Russia is still the major threat to NATO and that we shouldn't take our eyes off that? Because President Macron is perhaps more concerned about terrorism, he's concerned about the Sahel in Africa.
Well, definitely terrorism is a threat which will probably be on our screens for the nearest time, but Russia is a country which has been challenging by war the borders of its neighbors. Russia is making military exercises which are aimed at its neighbors, which are members of NATO.
I mean, you must acknowledge that the Turks are holding up an agreement to defend the Baltic states because they say that the YPG group in Syria should be recognized as terrorists first.
We of course understand also Turkish concerns, because every region needs to have a correct plan of defense. So I very much hope, first of all, that perhaps in this summit we will solve this issue and Turks will not block the further planning in our northern region. Because
but aren't they effectively blackmailing the rest of the alliance, the Turks? I mean, you must be furious about this.
You know, diplomacy knows different ways how to reach its goal, but I never doubted that Turkey would be ready to engage if we will ask for a paragraph 5, and that's the point.
So you think everybody would stand together if your country was invaded, for example?
Would, and they should, because otherwise they will be extremely unwise and they would simply invite for such type of invasion.
Are you saying that this birthday party is a out-and-out celebration, or are you saying it is overshadowed by deep divisions? Where do you stand?
I don't think there are such deep divisions. There are divisions, there are arguments against each other, of course, between different countries, but still we are, how to say, very close relatives. And if we are coming for the birthday party, then probably we will celebrate, we will argue, and we will come out stronger. Because those who do not talk or hide those arguments are much worse than those who sit at the table, talk with each other, and get stronger out of that.
Well, we promised you a choir, and here they were. They just stopped singing Silent Night. But the night is going to be anything but silent as the leaders arrive in the next few minutes. Almost 30 of them expected here at number 10 Downing Street. This is part of the welcoming committee, of course.
Welcome back to Buckingham Palace. We're expecting Donald Trump to leave any moment. We're keeping an eye on that to see the beast, the armoured Cadillac, leaving on the way to Downing Street. But let's return now to the purpose of why everyone's here today. The NATO meeting and heads of state have just been at a reception with the Queen behind me here. Joining me now is the Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, Dr. Karen von Hippel. It seems, just looking at it, that Boris Johnson has tried to sort of avoid being pictured with Donald Trump for fear of damaging his election campaign. But on the broader picture, how influential is the UK in NATO, do you think, now?
I think the UK is very influential in NATO. NATO is going through a bit of an existential crisis. So the meeting tomorrow, the bar is set so low because people are very aware of what Trump did in Brussels in 2018 and just basically spoiled the whole event by questioning the reason for the alliance. And so I think people are just hoping to get through this meeting in one piece without Trump doing anything too crazy. He's already said a couple things today that were not entirely appropriate about, obviously about the British election about Trudeau and the contribution Canada makes, and
Canadian,
and of course about President Macron's comment. He called him very, very nasty. In other words, only Trump is allowed to criticize NATO, but I guess no one else is.
Well, yeah, it is odd, isn't it? Because President Macron has said, NATO's brain dead.
Yeah.
Well, Donald Trump called it obsolete.
Yeah.
So you would have thought they wouldn't have too much to disagree about on that. So what's going on there?
I don't know. I really think he may think he's the only one allowed to criticize NATO. On the other hand, there is an impeachment hearing back in Washington, and I think he's trying to appear presidential this week. And I think he realizes that he probably needs a bit more support. He's a bit worried about, the independence in the United States that may lean the other way. And so he really is trying to be a statesman. He doesn't ever seem to recall what he said the day before, so it's almost irrelevant trying to remind him what he said the last time.
So where's the truth of it, though? Is NATO brain dead, as Macron says, or is it sustainable?
I absolutely think NATO's critically important. It is the most important military alliance probably in history. It's 70 years old, so like any organization that's quite old, it needs some reform. And in a sense, I think Macron gave a bit of a wake-up call. We've got to do something. We've got to change our approach. We've got to think more strategically. They're facing many, many threats on many fronts.
And different threats to what it was set up to
Different
combat.
threats,
So it was
right.
set up to combat the Soviet
Right,
threat.
the Soviet Union, and then that was, the 40th birthday and the 50th birthday, they were dealing with Kosovo, the Kosovo conflict, pretty much that was it. The 60th birthday, they were dealing with Afghanistan, and that was pretty much it. And now at the 70th birthday, they're dealing with cyber threats, they're dealing with Russia, they're dealing with threats from the south, migration, with terrorism, with all sorts of hybrid type threats. And so it just needs to repurpose itself.
Well, what about China? I mean, how?
And China,
that's
of
very
course.
divisive.
Yeah, absolutely. They need to figure out how to approach China. Obviously, they're talking about that. There's a lot of conversations about, do we have a dialogue with China? What should our approach be on IP, on cyber attacks? And so I think they will get there. And I don't actually think there's anything wrong with people publicly questioning, leaders publicly questioning NATO's purpose, because I do think NATO probably needs a bit of an injection of fresh, a little bit of panic maybe, so it can reform itself.
So will there be a 100th birthday for NATO?
Yeah,
do you think?
absolutely. I'm sure of it.
Larger?
I think enough of the countries are committed to it, and don't forget, even if Trump says negative things about NATO, the U.S. Congress is very committed to NATO and really will do everything they can to maintain support for the alliance. It could be larger, yeah.
I'm sure you'd love to be a fly on the wall in there. I would, and in Downing Street too. We're still waiting for Donald Trump to leave. The protesters have gone very quiet, expecting him to transfer up the road to Downing Street. But Karen von Hippel, thank you very much for joining us. Well, while in London, Donald Trump couldn't quite leave his outrage at home, railing against the Democrats trying to impeach him, calling them very unpatriotic for pursuing further hearings as he's overseas. Now he claims he won't be sending his lawyers to represent him because it's all a hoax. Our Washington correspondent Siobhan Kennedy is in Washington, D.C. So Siobhan, what is enraging President Trump now?
Well, he's angry, Kathy, because the Democrats are daring to press ahead with their inquiry despite the fact that he is not here. In the last 20 minutes or so, the Intelligence Committee has published its impeachment report, a summary, if you like, of their findings after those public hearings. And no surprise, they have concluded that there is ample evidence that Donald Trump abused the power of his office and should be impeached. Listen to this little snapshot of the exchanges that they have chosen to highlight today.
Was there a quid pro quo? With regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. Everyone was in the loop. We followed the president's orders.
But look at this, you can see here the Republicans' response to the exact same set of public hearings. You can see how they've taken the same facts but reached a very different conclusion. Kathy, listen to this.
Yeah, I was presuming. I assumed that I was presuming.
It was my assumption. I just assumed
it would be pure, guesswork on my part, speculation. I don't know.
The Republicans there, you can see, continuing to push that message. The president did nothing wrong and that everything the witnesses said was, in fact, hearsay. No one had first-hand evidence. That's in fact not the truth, but it's their message and they are sticking by it. The next set of public hearings begins tomorrow.
Well, Siobhan, thanks very much for that.
We should know by now that what President Trump says and what he does are not necessarily the same thing, or even, for that matter, related. Over here, for a NATO's 70th anniversary celebration, so strictly non-political, he said he would stay out of the British general election. You can probably see where this is going already. I think Boris will do a good job, he said. And he then came down firmly on the Prime Minister's side in the campaign row about whether parts of the NHS would be on sale to American companies as part of a post-Brexit trade deal. We wouldn't want it, even if it was handed to us on a silver platter, the President said. All of which might not actually help the Prime Minister on the grounds that being endorsed by Mr. Trump is not necessarily a big vote winner over here.
The American president out in the cold of Downing Street. At last! But where's his great friend, the British Prime Minister? Normally Boris Johnson likes being seen close to Donald Trump, but perhaps in this general election he worries that too obvious an endorsement from Mr. Trump wouldn't help his cause.
So I'll stay out of the election.
Phew, Johnson probably said.
Because I don't want to complicate it. I can, look, I've won a lot of elections for a lot of people, but I stay out of it.
But he couldn't quite resist the name drop.
I think Boris is very capable and I think he'll do a good job.
But what if Jeremy Corbyn is the next tenant of 10 Downing Street?
I can work with anybody. I'm a very easy person to work with, you know, you wouldn't believe it.
Whether he likes it or not, he is in this election because Labour claims that if Boris Johnson does a trade deal with him, US companies will want to buy part of our NHS and will force up drug prices for hospitals and us.
I don't even know where that rumour started. We have absolutely nothing to do with it, and we wouldn't want to. If you handed it to us on a silver platter, we want nothing to do with it.
Hang on, where did that rumour start?
Look, I think everything with a trade deal is on the table. When you're dealing in trade, everything's on the table. So NHS or anything else, or a lot more than that.
Which is why Jeremy Corbyn's been warning the NHS may be for sale. Now, he thinks leaked government documents back him up, and he isn't fussed at allegations that those documents were somehow obtained and leaked by Russia.
If the document is not accurate, then why is it it's been out there all this time? No minister has claimed it's inaccurate, no government has, and in reality, the minutes are there of meetings which involved Liam Fox in the early stages and officials later on. And Donald Trump himself said everything is on the table, including our National Health Service.
Here in Salisbury, the Tory leader will see you now.
Are you a doctor? Yes, I am. Wonderful. In the NHS?
I'm here.
Fantastic. Well, you're putting a lot more money into the NHS.
And she says you better keep that promise.
And the NHS. Just keep
Can categorically rule out that any part of the NHS will be on the table in any trade negotiation.
Turkish delight? Well, not at the NATO meeting where that country is a problem, but NATO is what he'd much rather be talking about today.
There is a stark contrast between our approach, which sees the value of NATO as the protector and guarantor of our security, and that of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, who actually want to disband NATO. It seems to me quite incredible.
Labour would say that what he's saying is incredible, that they're not enemies of NATO, and she doesn't trust Johnson one bit.
We're proposing an NHS protection bill that would expressly and in statute avoid and prevent and prohibit the NHS being on the table in trade negotiations, and I hope other parties would support that as the SNP does everything we can to stop the NHS being put at risk in that way.
We can all pray for that as we resolve our own differences at the ballot box, divided about whether he really has any desire at all to lay hands on our National Health Service.
And Robert is, of course, here to talk about all this. I thought Mr. Trump's promise to stay out of British politics went pretty well. Is a Trump endorsement good, bad or indifferent for the Prime Minister in your view?
Well, it's quite striking, isn't it, that before the election, Boris Johnson was desperately keen to be seen in the company of the US president, partly because he wanted to persuade British people that Donald Trump would speed through a trade deal that he thinks would be good for British prosperity. But he will be acutely aware that in 2016, when a much less controversial American president, Barack Obama, came out effectively backing David Cameron's campaign to remain in the EU, it backfired because millions of British people don't like the idea of any foreign leader telling them how to vote. So no photo opportunities today of the two of them together, and I think Boris Johnson will try and keep his distance tomorrow. In fact, he's gone sort of slightly further than that in comments that he made today. He said that he wants to press ahead with putting taxes on these big US digital companies like Google, despite the fact that France has done that and is facing the wrath of Donald Trump, who's imposing tariffs on things like champagne and luxury goods made in France. So Boris Johnson is actually interestingly sending out a signal that he doesn't right now want to be that close to Donald Trump. Whether that is he's altogether pleased that Donald Trump also said today that he could work with anybody, including Jeremy Corbyn, Boris Johnson's nemesis, I'm not so sure that's particularly pleasing for the British Prime Minister, because in the end there are lots of Labour voters, although they may not at all like the attitudes and the values of Donald Trump, they want any British Prime Minister to have a reasonable relationship with America. So at the moment I would broadly say that this isn't turning out particularly good for Johnson. It's obviously not a great win for Corbyn either. We'll see what Trump will throw into the mix tomorrow, because I can't believe he's going to be quiet and uncontroversial. Do you?
No, chance to be a fine thing. Now, speaking of President Trump, he wasn't just ruffling feathers with the British political establishment. We've all been to joint birthday parties where the hosts ended up squabbling. They're related too. Now, NATO's 70th anniversary gathering, supposedly a celebration of past unity and future collaboration, turned into a row between mainly Mr. Trump, you guessed it, and President Macron. The American president, not always a fan of NATO, it must be said, stuck up for it against criticism from the French one that it is strategically brain dead. That's not at all upping the ante on political language. Now, tomorrow the Prime Minister will try to smooth things over with a one for all for one message.
Sweeping into Buckingham Palace this evening for what's meant to be a celebration, with minimum politics and all the dangers that entails. But already it isn't working out quite that way. Any NATO meeting that includes President Trump runs the risk of a row over money. But throw in France and Turkey throwing their weight around as well, and the happy family photo staged before dinner this evening hides a multitude of domestic arguments. Trump is threatening a trade war with Germany if Berlin doesn't cough up its share of NATO spending. Enough for France to describe the alliance now as brain dead. What shot back Donald Trump this morning? How dare you criticize NATO?
When you make a statement like that, that is a very, very nasty statement to essentially 28, including them, 28 countries. And you just can't go around making statements like that about NATO. It's very disrespectful.
It's almost as if Trump was rather enjoying Macron being the bad guy at a NATO get-together. After Macron visited Downing Street, he said he stood by his brain-dead statement. But when he then met Trump, they clashed again, this time over the fate of ISIS fighters being held by US forces in Syria.
Would you like some nice ISIS fighters? Look, I can give them to you. You can take everyone you want. Let's be serious.
Let's be serious, he says, and these rows are becoming all too serious. Add to the mix Turkey's President Erdogan, who's buying Russian air defense systems and whose invasion of Syria has challenged US forces there. And you have an alliance in which some think the internal divisions are an even greater threat than that posed by external enemies. Canada's Prime Minister insists current problems are nothing unusual.
Is the internal threats bigger than the external threats? You know, NATO has survived for 70 years because we've always had frank, real conversations. There have been disagreements that we've worked through. There have been differences in perspective, differences in priorities.
Many in the alliance would probably prefer not to sit around a table tomorrow, however briefly, with all the dangers of exposing further fault lines. But meet they will, briefly, at a hotel near Watford, hoping no doubt that no one else feels there are things they need to get off their chest.
And James is already in Watford, where tomorrow's meeting is happening, as he was suggesting. James, it doesn't look like the happiest of birthday celebrations for NATO, does it? What do you think tomorrow will bring?
Well, they'll be hoping for a quieter day. They may not get it. It's all been designed to minimise controversy. The meeting is just 3 hours long. It's not been called a summit. It's just a conference. The leaders only get 4 minutes each. Boris Johnson, as you were saying, going to use his for some stirring one for all for one type talk. But the danger may come in the press conferences that come afterwards if, for example, President Trump continues to threaten Germany with punitive tariffs, almost trade sanctions, if they don't up their defence spending, which would obviously be unprecedented and quite extraordinary. If France and Turkey continue to air their differences in public, if President Macron continues wanting to think about NATO's future in public, at the very moment when everyone else is sort of saying to themselves, look, hang on, Donald Trump faces election at the end of next year. He may lose by the end of 2020. American policy on NATO may be very different. So, I mean, in many ways, this alliance is working pretty well in terms of defence spending is going up and technical cooperation and deployments. It's at the top. It's the politics that may yet prove to be its downfall.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed. Now, you could say it has been a long time coming, but today the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn finally said sorry for the level of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, or everything that has happened, as he put it. But even then, it had to be wrung out of him by Philip Schofield on ITV's This Morning, and Romilly is here to talk about this. What happened, in essence?
Well, it's not
an apology after all this time, clearly, you know, but it has been a while.
Yeah, and it's not just what he said, but how he said it. Labour's just been unable to get on the front foot over this issue of anti-Semitism, and it hasn't helped that Jeremy Corbyn has seemed unable to apologise, despite the clear and continuing upset in the Jewish and wider community, which is a pretty bizarre approach, given that he has apologised in the past and that members of his shadow cabinet have chosen recently to do so. And it was only under heavy pressure on This Morning that he finally said this. Have a listen.
Okay. Our party, can I make it clear?
Just say sorry.
No, wait a minute. I and our party.
No, just say sorry.
Come on, let me say. Can I say something?
Well,
our party.
I want you to say sorry.
And our party and me.
Yeah.
Do not accept anti-Semitism in any form.
So are you sorry for anything that's happened?
Obviously, I'm very sorry for everything that's happened. But I want to make this clear. I am dealing with it. I have dealt with it.
Pretty awkward. He did go on to make the point that other parties have issues with racism. The Conservative Party, of course, have had problems with Islamophobia. But I think the apparently grudging nature of that apology won't necessarily have helped. The president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews has already said that it is not enough to draw a line under it for them. They feel that instances of anti-Semitism are not being dealt with quickly or seriously enough. It is pretty extraordinary that this has been an issue for Labour since 2015, and it is still festering through their election campaign.
OK, Romilly, thank you very much indeed. So, does replacing the Prime Minister in a televised debate with a block of ice break the rules on television impartiality? No, it doesn't, according to the regulator Ofcom, in reply to a complaint by the Conservative Party. Channel 4 put the ice sculpture in Mr Johnson's place when he did not take part in their climate change debate last Thursday. Ofcom said broadcasters have editorial freedom in determining the format of any election debate during the debate and in subsequent news coverage. Ofcom said Channel 4 had reflected the Conservatives' viewpoint on climate issues.